Okay, I press record and just so I don't forget to press it. Oh, we have 13 participants already.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to wait a minute or two for people to join our call. We are very excited to have you and to discuss Mahjong tonight. Thank you all for coming. Very exciting.
It's a great thing to talk about.
Abigail, how did you and the center decide on Mahjong as a topic for today?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to go into that.
Then never mind. No spoilers.
No problem. Yeah, I can get started and welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you everyone for coming to this panel discussion on Mahjong, a people-to-people exchange game. My name is Abigail Hall, and I'm a program associate at the Confucius Institute U.S. Center. And for those of you who don't know what the center does, we are a nonprofit organization which promotes the value of global education broadly and support the learning of Chinese language and culture in the United States and cross-cultural engagement. And I'm really excited for all of you to join us tonight. So, Mahjong, in its simplest definition, is a game played with 144 tiles and originally created in Qing Dynasty China. And now it's a game played around the world with a rich history and complexity in the United States. So I began kind of researching this topic and interest in learning more about Mahjong when I started playing more games because of the pandemic. I started learning chess and was curious how this, Chinese game was incorporated, as a form of exchange and community identity and learning. So I decided to learn more and that this would be an interesting panel discussion. And I have learned that there's just so much complexity and richness to it. And I'm so excited to unpack that with the other panelists and to learn with you all. So, so we, during this panel discussion, are going to take a dive into how Mahjong could be understood as an example of cultural exchange and how a game can form and engage identity and community. So first, I am going to introduce each of our panelists, and then we have around 35 minutes of panel discussion. And then we will have 10 minutes for question and answer. And for all of you in the audience, since we are in Zoom webinar, you can type in your question into the Q&A section, and we will get your questions then and field at the end. So thank you very much. I will go right ahead and introduce our panelists. So Elise Hines is an American history professor at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, and sexuality. She's the author of Mahjong, a Chinese game and making of modern American culture, which explores the American history of the game in the first half of the 20th century. So this book really follows the history of how this game can share how it engages in our daily lives and individuals create cultural change. So I'm really interested to learn more about her book. And then we have Greg Swain. She's the co-author of American Mahjong for Everyone, A Beginner's Guide, which introduces beginners to the game, and Mahjong, the art of the game, which focuses on exploring the art and some of the meaning behind the tiles. So in addition to her interest in Mahjong, she has studied art history and she has her doctorate in clinical psychology, which I think could be both relevant to understanding the game in all of its complexity. And last but not least, we have Patrick Hamilton, who has taught Mahjong in the local DC area. So interesting kind of background. Growing up in his house in the Midwest, he learned Mahjong and had uncles and cousins who played Mahjong because of a great aunt who was an importer of Mahjong tiles. So since then, and since the late 1970s, his academic and career interests made him a regular traveler to Asia. And he has been able to use Mahjong as kind of a way to get to know people and communities where he may, have a lot of cultural and language barriers, which I'm really curious on learning more about that. So he has traveled all around Asia, Southern Yunnan, Tibet, Hong Kong, Mongolia, and he, like I said, has coached Mahjong for senior citizens and has seen some of the effects of maintaining community and social contact in that community. So thank you all panelists for joining us, and I am very excited to dive in more. So my first question is, so you all have kind of a unique history and kind of introduction to the game of Mahjong, and I'm wondering if each of you could briefly share a little bit more about how you began to be interested in the topic of Mahjong. And Elise, if you would like to start.
Sure. So thank you so much for inviting us to be on this panel today. My interest in Mahjong really began more than a dozen years ago, and I came to it because I was living in southern China. I was actually living in Yunnan province for a year before I began my PhD, and I didn't go knowing that I would eventually write a dissertation and then a book on the history of the game in the United States. I was only loosely familiar with the game, but I learned it from a friend of mine whose grandfather had taught her. She was a Chinese friend and her grandfather was from Shanghai. And I enjoyed it. I was instantly taken with the sensory aspects of it. It's a really enjoyable game to hold and to play. The tiles feel fantastic in your hand. They're really beautiful. It's a really unique experience. And at the same time, my aunt actually visited me in China, and she had grown up in Denver. She didn't play Mahjong, and but many of her friends who were Jewish American women did, and their mothers had in the 1950s and 60s when she was growing up in a strongly Jewish neighborhood in Denver. And so she knew about this cultural association in the United States. And she said, clearly this is a Chinese game. How and why do all my Jewish friends play this game? And I thought that it was a question that I could just look up and find out. And what I quickly discovered is that a lot of people had asked the question and no one had done the scholarly research to really find out, right? There are a lot of theories, but we didn't know. And so that's what started me in my interest in these connections. And when I was in graduate school, that wasn't also my immediate research project, but my second research paper, I just went back to this question and I just scratched the surface of the historical record and discovered this incredible national and international fad during the 1920s. And I had no idea that existed. This was before Project Mahjong, the museum exhibit that has traveled around. No one was talking about this 1920s fad yet at that point. And it was clear that this was an incredibly rich and complicated story in the United States as well. And then I just kept going from there.
Very interesting. So learning Mahjong when you were in China and then coming back and seeing this you know, whole community and lots of questions based on that. Very interesting. Very cool. Greg, would you like to introduce how you became interested in Mahjong?
Right. Well, I grew up in New York City, and New York City had a lot of different people playing Mahjong. There were, of course, the ladies who were playing it on the sidewalks. When I was growing up, it was really kind of before everybody had air conditioning. So in the summertime, everybody would go onto the sidewalks with card tables and sit in the shade, and they put their chairs around, and I would walk down the street, and everybody would just be having such a good time. There'd be a lot of laughter. But I was also very intrigued by the words that they were saying, because they were saying very exotic words, bamboo and dragon and crack. And so I was very intrigued by the language of the game, but really enthusiastic about learning it because everybody was just having so much fun. But it really wasn't until 2010 that I learned how to play. And it was really kind of comical because I would keep telling people, oh, I really want to learn how to play Mahjong. And they would say, well, what kind of Mahjong do you want to learn how to play? And I wouldn't know how to answer that because I didn't know what anybody was playing. I just knew that those ladies on the street were having a wonderful, wonderful time, and I wanted to play whatever they were playing. So anyway, I had a wonderful teacher back in 2010, Linda Feinstein, who taught me how to play the game. And then we played together. Some of us played together as a group. The people who had studied with me played together as a group. And I bought some vintage tiles, and I removed a sticker from one of the vintage tiles and discovered this really beautiful carving. And I got very excited by the carving. And so I did what everybody does when they want to find out something, is I Googled, the meaning of the images on Mahjong tiles, and there was nothing online about it. So then I got very, very excited, and we were able to write a book for Tuttle, which was the first book ever about Mahjong art. And so Mahjong really changed my life because I didn't know. Oh, thank you, Patrick. Yes, thank you. So I never envisioned that I would know so much about Mahjong and that I would go around telling people how wonderful it is, but it's just been a wonderful addition to my life and my mental life and also my emotional life. I have so many friends that I've met around the Mahjong table, so it's been a real treat. So I can't say enough good about Mahjong.
It sounds like that community aspect really draws you in.
Yes.
For sure. Thank you. Patrick?
The community aspect that Greg touched on is something I'd like to return to because that's been the hinge for me. It's been huge for me, very important. And thank you, Abigail. You gave away all my best bits in your introduction of me. So to sum up your intro very quickly, yes, I was raised in a small farming community in the Midwest, north central Indiana. Happened to be surrounded with Mahjong sets because I had a wacky aunt who was an importer. I have no idea how she lived, but she left behind Mahjong sets, which all of us, my cousins and all, each one got one. I sort of tucked that away in my brain. Fun thing, but off to university, a couple degrees later, a couple careers later, which involved taking me back and forth to Asia quite often. That reignited the interest. Then for the last 12 years or so, I've been at various times teaching mostly Tibetan kids through a Tibetan girls project, including Kunming. Annalise, I wonder, were you in Kunming in Yunnan? Best food.
Yes, exactly. I taught at Yunda.
Oh, really? So you know the Kunming Eternal Spring City stickers everywhere? Yeah, best weather, best food, nicest people. And everyone, I'll put it in a slightly different, it was actually in Xining. I was staying at a hostel for teachers and had some of the students there. Anytime you go into such a place, there's a gathering room, tea is always, all I have to do is sit down, I sort of look around, you find a Mahjong set. I start kind of pulling tiles together. and locals are kind of looking, and within about 2 minutes, you've got people sitting down. Oh, you play? What kind you play? Shanghai, Hong Kong, which scoring card do you use? So I have my scoring card with me, and it just takes off. And the consequence of a 2-hour Mahjong game with people you don't know, you now have 4 to 8 new friends. And the kind of talk that you want to have with foreign friends that you've never met before happens so easily in that milieu, because there's a level of trust. You're not a tourist snapping pictures of them doing something exotic. You're correcting their kids when they get the tiles wrong. It's a very bonding sort of thing. We've talked about other games. I also play Wei Qi, but Wei Qi players are sitting there so serious. There's no bonding going on. They're just too serious to. But Xiangqi, if you play Xiangqi Chinese chess, then kibitzing, there must be a wonderful Mandarin word for the Yiddish word kibitz, because I've never seen a Xiangqi game where there weren't more people talking over the players than, but I think for the best is Mahjong. The community. Well, then I come back to, I live in Chinatown here, but I work for Capitol Hill Village, a few blocks beyond me here. I do various things for the village as a volunteer, which is my connection. But when I mentioned that I played Mahjong, it got me thinking about it. So I did a little bit of background research online, the relationship between dementia, Alzheimer's, and learning something new. So we have perhaps 350 families in Capitol Hill Village, many of whom have seniors who are facing serious challenges. Many of them thought, well, when I retire, I'll just continue reading French novels and I'll have enough time to improve my French. And the research that I was finding was, if you already know something well, don't expand that. You want new neuron pathworks. You want to find new connections in your brain. Go learn something you don't know anything about. So our group is composed entirely of people who knew nothing about Mahjong. But also because it's including so many people who are dealing with dementia, Alzheimer's, memory issues, we start every game afresh. Now, why can't I pung that? Why can't I chow that? But she sits on my left. Can't I pung that? I said, yes, you can pung. So we start with ground zero, how to build a wall, which always somebody says, why do I have too many tiles? I said, because you've got too few in your wall. So we start from that. But then the pandemic strikes. And from being a convivial group, having snacks and noshes around somebody's table in their living room, we're totally isolated. The value of maintaining the connection for the Mahjong group was very, very important. And Capitol Hill Village encouraged us to move to Zoom, by and large, it became a cocktail party because we haven't found a live online Mahjong game that I can use with these people. Especially because we play Chinese style. The online games that I've been able to find are generally American style, which we don't do. But that discussion we haven't yet had, have we?
Thank you. A lot there with the, learning about the different types of Mahjong and the different communities, whether it be people in Capitol Hill or people, that you're teaching English with. Very, very good. Thank you. So Annalise, I was wondering if you could help us get a sense of when you were doing your research on kind of the transnationalism from, Mahjong in China to Mahjong in the United States. And I'm if you could describe to us a little bit about the communities that play Mahjong in the US, because I think there's some distinctive characteristics of them, and what you learned kind of from that element.
Sure. Well, the history of Mahjong in the United States, and in many ways, the history of Mahjong as the game we know it today around the world, begins in the early 1920s, especially. That is when American businessmen who were in China learned the game and marketed it to an American public. They did so in a way and at a historical moment where a broader American public was eager to seize upon this game that they marketed as an exotic, new, exciting consumer good. And that market was so huge, it really blew up almost overnight. And in my book, I talk about the various marketing strategies and the business approaches that made that possible. But that huge consumption of the game drove a new interest in manufacturing it and selling it that also sparked interest around the world. The rich and famous were playing it. And in China, the game had been spreading since the late 1800s. People in urban centers were increasingly becoming familiar with the game. At the end of the Qing Dynasty, the Empress Dowager really got into it, and her court was playing it at the turn of the 20th century. It emerged out of Shanghai, it was part of courtesan culture, but it was also one of many games. And it was primarily an urban game. It was not widely known out of certain urban centers. And in the 1920s, when suddenly the president and first lady Harding of the United States and Hollywood celebrities are playing it, as well as Chinese intellectuals and urban elites, it sparks a broader interest in the game around the world and in China. And this is the period in which it becomes known as the national game of China. And so in the 1920s in the United States, this is a game that is touching all sectors of society. Spanish language newspapers in Texas are talking about it. Small town newspapers in Nebraska are talking about it, and everyone in between, and everyone on the coast, certainly. And so in this context, it becomes associated and marketed as a game of the elite, especially white Americans with money. But in fact, it really is crossing social boundaries during this time. Everyone is at least talking about this game, if not playing it. And African-American club women in Chicago and working class Chinese immigrants and like I said, also people with money, they're all playing the game and are excited about it for what they understand it to be and for their own experience playing it. And that so in this, we can talk more about some of the problematic issues with how the game was marketed and understood as specifically this exotic and Orientalist good, and how Chinese Americans responded to that. But in answer to your question, in terms of who was playing it and how it crossed those social boundaries, this is really the time that that happens. But it was a fad, and I think there are specific cultural reasons why it took off in that time. But because that it was an inherently short-lived kind of phenomenon, it dies out as a mainstream widespread fad by the mid to late 1920s, but pockets of people are still playing the game. And one of those pockets is a group of officers' wives in the branch of the military that eventually becomes the Air Force in World War II. Another pocket are Jewish American women who connect with each other, most of whom are located in the New York area in the late 1930s. So in the late 1930s and early 1940s, you have the growth of specifically and uniquely American variants of the game. And these still exist today. So Wright-Patterson, that is developed by officers' wives in the Air Force, that's still played on bases around the world. The largest and most famous American variation is the one led by the National Mahjong League. which began in the late 1930s. And that's what today people call American Mahjong. They called their game National Mahjong. And that is the game so strongly associated with Jewish American women, and Jewish American women really helped make it a part of middle-class Jewish culture in the 1950s and 1960s, and are some of these women who Greg probably saw enjoying themselves, laughing, and really creating a profoundly pervasive and consistent and strong social fabric, particularly led by young mothers in the 1950s and 60s. Today, just to quickly finish your question, I realize you were asking today. After the immigration reform in the 1960s, that ended an exclusion era that had really restricted Asian immigration. Asian immigration has continued to grow and diversify, and with it has come a massive diversification of Asian styles of playing Mahjong in the United States today that continue to evolve and coexist with the various American variants that are also alive and well.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like that was a very concise understanding of a very complex history of, from the 1920s all the way till today. But what I'm hearing from that is that it began as kind of businessmen from the United States going over to China and taking this kind of element that they've, this Mahjong game with them, and then kind of taking it as their own and engaging with their own community in this Mahjong game in a way that it is kind of developed into different variations and different styles, which we can see still today in terms of American Mahjong, Asian styled Mahjong, which is very interesting in terms of a diverse range of people who have played Mahjong and interactions with that. Greg, I am curious and would love to learn more about your book that focuses on teaching the beginners of Asian or American Mahjong. And what was your inspiration for starting that book, and what did you learn along the way?
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about that. Well, as you heard, I learned from a wonderful teacher in 2010, but wonderful teachers aren't always around. So I thought that there would be an opportunity to write a book that could really break down the principles of the game and really explain it to people, that could be used in addition to having a wonderful teacher, or if you can't find a teacher, you could learn the game that way. And I paired up with Toby Salk, who's on the West Coast. So we have an East-West Coast thing going on. And we both have been teaching for a while. We both love teaching. And we put a book together showing our different styles and our slightly different approaches to the game, but really breaking it down, step by step. And actually, I'm very lucky. I have a wonderful husband, Woody Swain, who's a very talented art director and artist, and he did all the illustrations for the book. So it was a nice little team effort there. But we had a wonderful time putting it together. And what we also did in the book is we have a tile set that's in the back of the book, so that if people are thinking, well, I don't know if I want to spend any money for a Mahjong set, I'm not sure I'm really going to like it, we have some very nice little tiles in the back that people can cut out and put on cardboard if they so desire. But we also have a website. And the website allows us to keep the book up to date, and it keeps the references up to date on different books that people can read, etc. And answers are kept up to date, because the National Mahjong League changes the card every year. So we have to learn every year a new card. So that was the wonderful opportunity that we had with a website. And while we were putting the book together, as Patrick was mentioning, so much information was coming out about how really valuable the game of Mahjong is. And it almost doesn't even matter what version of the game you play. You're using your mind in a way that you really don't use it when you're doing most other activities. And even just socializing around the table adds another aspect to it. So your brain is really firing on all cylinders. And if you learn to play different styles or with different sets, you're getting seriously, one of the best workouts you can for your brain. So I just think everybody should be playing this game. Doesn't matter their age. If they're young, they can learn a lot of strategies from it. And if they're older, literally playing Mahjong can help them with their memory and focus. It literally changes them, even if they've already started to go in the direction of dementia. The game can help them even 1 month after playing it. So I think the game is something that should be on everybody's list of things to do.
And if I can just join a shout out for Toby. Toby Selk, Greg's co-author, actually taught me American Mahjong when I was living in San Francisco when I was getting my PhD at Stanford. And yes, I love Toby, and anybody in the Bay Area who's looking for a teacher, she's a wonderful teacher.
Thank you. Greg, since you are talking about your books, and now I would love to lead into more of the connection of Mahjong as a Chinese game and what we can learn about elements of Chinese and Chinese American culture. So I know that with your second book, and you have learned a lot about Chinese art through the process of researching the book. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what you learned through the process about Chinese art and the tiles.
So with Mahjong, the art of the game, I learned all about Chinese art. I had majored in art history at college, but never took Chinese art. And I was just so intrigued. I was so intrigued by the art, but I basically didn't know where to start because so often the images were very cryptic. So I just bought a lot of books on Chinese art, and I gave myself a crash course in Chinese art. And I learned that if you know what could be there, then you can see it there, because so often things are very abbreviated on the tiles. But then I thought, oh my goodness, that's a go board. Okay, and that's one of the arts of the scholar, and that, oh, that's rolled up painting. Okay, another art of the scholar. So I was able to learn just by looking at the flower tiles, which are usually the beautiful tiles of the set, and they're the ones that the best craftsmen in the shop would be making. But those tiles were really ways to celebrate Chinese culture. So that the craftsmen would put on those tiles everything that they were proud of. So different places in China that were beautiful, or different inventions. I mean, when China opened up the trade routes, that was right there on the tiles. Steamships taking, products from one place to another, trains taking it. But that was all there on the tiles, but nobody had really looked at it before in terms of understanding its place in history. And just as a wonderful coincidence, there's a man in Wales, Ray Heaton, who's been the person who's translated a lot of the sayings on these flower tiles, because on every single flower tile there's a Chinese word, and those Chinese words refer to something that can be part of Chinese stories or culture or even propaganda. So it just became fascinating, really looking at the tiles and understanding them and for their place in Chinese history and culture. And by studying them, I learned so much about the world. I learned about World War II. I learned about Chinese opera. These tiles opened up a whole world to me that I never knew existed. And I try to share a little bit of that whenever I teach the game, but certainly when I go out and do talks, all I do is I show these little tiles and I'll say, you can't believe the amount of information on these tiles, on these tiny little, like 1.5-inch high tiles, because with these tiles, you can learn so much about China. So it really was a wonderful entry point for me to learn just studying the artwork.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think I liked how you phrased it as an entry point. I truly believe that in terms of cross-cultural exchanges and learning about a different culture, anyone can kind of find something of interest and of passion that you can connect people with, whether it's, Mahjong game or it's food or music. So very interesting to hear how that was kind of an entry point into learning more about China. Annalise, I am very curious on one of the papers that you wrote. You explained that Mahjong is still very much a Chinese game, but it has also become truly American. And wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So it matters that Mahjong is a Chinese game. It is certainly in most of the sets that are still being used today. One of the things that unites these styles of play across changing rules are the patterns in the tiles and their connection to Chinese history and Chinese culture. Greg was just talking about some of the most ornate tiles with these really exquisite scenes. But we see that even in American-made tiles from the 1950s, 60s, 70s that are using the same images as had been produced by the craftsmen in the 1920s. That are more standardized and are being created by machine rather than by hand. But with them, it carries, again, that sense of connection. And for people for whom the Chinese Mahjong connects to a heritage, a family heritage, a personal ethnic heritage, that is particularly important and particularly strong. And so in an American context where Asian people have been repeatedly racialized is an academic term that's starting to be used in the public discourse, but basically othered, right? Or setting into a category that through exclusion, through legal exclusion, through social and economic discrimination, forms of connection and community building that are also integrated into American life and American fabric are very powerful and very important. So that this is something that Chinese Americans in the 1920s and 1930s who were born in the United States, who were educated in American universities and couldn't get jobs relative to their education level in the United States, lots of messages that they were getting that they were not fully American. This was a game that was embraced by white Americans, but was also very much theirs and associated strongly with Chinese culture and Chinese heritage, and as a point of pride. And so that in each historic moment, there are specific forms that takes, and that attachment and the meaning for different immigrant groups and children of immigrants and generationally racialized people is particularly important. And at the same time, the game has continued to evolve in the American context by people who are children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who came from China or from other Asian countries that developed their own versions of the game, as well as people who didn't, people who are children and grandchildren of people in the 1920s who are white Americans who picked up the game and also enjoyed it and made it their own. And now, particularly for Jewish American women, there's also a strong generational connection, so that people who are playing with their grandmother's sets, who have passed away, it's a very visceral, very powerful kind of feeling of, I'm getting to connect with this person through the tiles that they loved, that they held, that they played with every week. And it's a part of my culture too. It's a part of my ethnic identity too, not mine uniquely. I'm speaking now as someone who inherited a tradition that was born also in the United States. And so, in as much as this is true of much of American history and much of American culture, it is a contradictory one of inclusion and exclusion. And Mah Jong is very much a part of that story, and has powerful resonances for different groups of people in different ways. And today it is increasingly, each form of the game is increasingly diversifying. It's no longer as strongly kind of associated with specific national origin groups or ethnic identities or gender. As people are getting older and moving into retirement communities, they're learning and playing with new people. As people are learning about the game from movies like Crazy Rich Asians, and then turning to learn Chinese or Japanese or other forms of the game, there are lots of ways that this is also crossing boundaries right now. So it is, again, very much a part of that American story.
Thank you. That is really helpful, because that sentence definitely intrigued me, and I wanted you to speak on that more, because I think it's kind of it's very important in terms of, when understanding Mahjong, to appreciate kind of the deep cultural heritage that it has in the Chinese and the Chinese American community. And also this story of inclusion and exclusion, and how it's become a sense of heritage with other communities as well, which I think is just very beautiful, and passing along sets, and that's I love learning about that, and I think it's really important in terms of the history of the game, and how it can be so much more than just a board game. For sure.
We'd be remiss.
So,
I think we'd be remiss. Oh, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the Joy Luck Club, of how the mother's immigrant level generation, Mahjong for them once a week was holding them together and maintaining their community, maintaining their sense of self in the Bay Area community. But for their daughters who were off at Stanford and Berkeley, it was something that they did to integrate themselves, remind themselves of their Chinese heritage. At the same time, they're doing it all in English, although they're playing Chinese style. And they're talking about how it is cultivating in them a sense of their own Americanness. That here they are, second generation Chinese, playing Mahjong as graduate students in American universities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I haven't read the Joy Luck Club, but I think there's probably a lot of stories very similar to that. In terms of the heritage and the appreciation of the depth that the Mahjong game can play, I am curious on each of your thoughts and advice in terms of, as someone who is interested in learning about the game of Mahjong, how can we work to continue to appreciate the heritage that Mahjong has, whether it be the deeply Chinese cultural roots of Mahjong, or the other communities that have had years of history in the game. Annalise, if you want to go first.
Sure. I think that it is a really important piece in terms of understanding and really learning from the past. So what we saw in the 1920s when the game, again, was a huge commercial success, driven initially by white businessmen, actually soon also joined by many other importers, including Chinese and Chinese American importers. But what we saw in the overall culture of the fad that was repeated over and over and over again in songs, in plays, in music, so it's really hard to describe the level of cultural production that this fad inspired. It was repeatedly referred to as an ancient game, often explicitly in contrast to living, breathing Chinese people and culture, and especially distanced from what had become a really negative and vicious stereotype of working class Chinese immigrants. This was part of anti-Chinese feeling that was all over the world in the late 1800s, 19th century. And in the American media, there was this embrace of an explicitly Chinese game, but doing so in a very hollow way that was really about embracing a stereotyped, caricatured understanding of ancient Chinese culture, divorced from modern Chinese people or any actual interaction with Chinese American people, apart from a kind of a hierarchical service industry type interactions. And so I think as we embrace the possibilities of exactly what Greg was talking about, of an entry point, of learning more, of engaging, of appreciating, and also continuing to, yes, adapt and evolve, we need to be sure we are actually genuinely engaged and listening to people who are also inheritors of this heritage, both as Chinese people, but also as, in our context in the United States, of Asian Americans who are continuing to live today in a time of really heightened feelings of exclusion and threat and violence, to make sure that we are, again, not replicating the mistakes of the past where we think we're embracing a Chinese culture that's actually divorced from listening to people who share our society and our history and have helped make this incredibly wonderful game still a vibrant part of American culture today. And so I think it's really embracing that idea of an entry point, and also really engaging in our contemporary society and making sure that we're really listening to.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think in terms of entry point and learning from the past, so we don't repeat ourselves, and I think just the humility to listen and engage in the people who have the inheritors of Mahjong. Thank you. Yes, Patrick?
The pandemic bit my group bad because we were just on the edge of, we had a long going discussion that I think was about to come to a head in late 2019, because I live in Chinatown and Capitol Hill is not that far. We were looking for restaurants where we could play Chinese style. Maybe they would give us a table in the back or a table upstairs. There's several that are up and down, where they would be happy to have us come and play in the restaurant so that we could engage with Chinese, with the staff, with patrons who were coming. We're just almost that close to making that happen when the pandemic hit and everything's back on hold. But I think that would, since we play a style that they recognize and that folks would be comfy sitting down and schmoozing with us, and we're going to buy food and snacks. Because when I play with my friends in Hong Kong, it's always in the context of everybody in the room, snacks and tea coming and going at all hours. And you're paying a bit of a tab at the end, which is just great. So we were trying to recreate that here in DC Chinatown. I hope so.
I love that. I think that's a great idea. And unfortunately, the pandemic has ruined so many so many things and changed our world upside down in a lot of ways. Greg, I wanted to give you a chance to answer that question as well.
Thank you. I wanted to mention, it's so funny that we're giving this talk for the Confucius Institute, because actually when the marketers were sitting there in those rooms in China back in the 1920s, one way that they thought of to market the game was to say that Confucius, they had two different theories, either that Confucius had invented the game or that Confucius played the game, both of which are completely wrong because Confucius was already dead for over 1,000 years before the game started. But basically everybody in the world knew about, well, the people that they were marketing to knew about Confucius and knew that he was very smart. And so they wanted to have him as part of the lure of the game. The other thing that they did is they changed many things. The original game of Mahjong was a beautiful multi-layered game, and sadly the marketers didn't think that the Americans or the Europeans would be smart enough to understand all the multi-layered things that were going on at the Mahjong table. So they simplified the game, and every manufacturer had different rules and different scoring, which meant that any 4 people who buy 4 different sets couldn't agree on how to play because there were 4 different sets of rules. So things became chaotic and things were really cut off from the reality of China, but also the people were buying what the marketers wanted them to think about China, not necessarily the real China. So there was a whole disconnect really from the very beginning about the game. But I just also wanted to mention that the game that is played in China today is not the game that was played early at the beginning of the 20th century. That game was declared illegal during the Cultural Revolution, and only after the government officials got together and figured out a way that would not be promoting gambling, because there was a real problem with gambling, were people finally allowed to play Mahjong again. I mean, and that was just a very difficult time. Although the Cultural Revolution was difficult, but they weren't even allowed to play Mahjong. I do know of one family that played with the curtains drawn and on carpet and, not even talking, but because they just could not give up the game of Mahjong. It was so important to them. So the game really has a very important place in the hearts of Chinese people, but also Americans, as Annalise was talking about, people who have games that were sets that were their mothers or their grandmothers. Sometimes they don't even play with those games. Sometimes they're just sitting on a shelf, but it helps them maintain a connection. And that connection also happens in Chinese families where they might not play the game, but that set, their grandfather's set, is sitting right there on the shelf and it makes them feel connected. So it just really gets into the hearts of people who play. It's an amazing situation.
Thank you. I'm realizing that we are running short on time, and I do want to allow for question and answer, but I would really love, just very briefly, if each of you all could give some recommendations in terms of if anyone would like to learn more about Mahjong, whether it be, your book request or ways to learn about it online or other community resources.
Right. Well, I might just start in that we do have, my book has a website, American Mahjong for Everyone does have a website listing some resources, but online you have the wonderful Michelle Frizzell, who teaches about 3 or 4 different types of Mahjong. So people can really go and learn different types of Mahjong just online, but Michelle Frizzell teaches all of them. And they're really wonderful entry points for how to learn the game. So thank goodness for YouTube, I have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, Annalise?
Sorry, I was muted. The classic Zoom mistake. I would love it if people wanted to check out my website, which includes a link to my book. The book is about to come out May 8th, which is very exciting. Thank you, with Oxford University Press. And it's sold everywhere books are sold. So those links are on my website, but there's also links to articles that have and interviews I've done. There was a really wonderfully produced episode by Angelo Bautista on NPR's To the Best of Our Knowledge, which he devoted. There's a whole episode of To the Best of Our Knowledge all about games and the social meaning of games. And there's a whole section on Mahjong, and actually Linda Feinstein, Greg's wonderful instructor who's taught an incredible number of people. She's actually interviewed on it. So it's a really wonderful episode, and that link is on there as well. My website address, I don't know what the best way is to put it, but it's www.a as in apple, m as in mother, my last name, Hines, HEINZ.org, not com, but org. So it's actually, the one that was out in the chat is not quite right. There we go. I just put it in the chat. The link should go there directly. Thank you. And if anybody wants to engage further over email or through the website, I'm always happy to be in touch.
Thank you, Annalise. Patrick?
Abby, there's how you found me. You contacted a local game shop where,
Yeah, I did.
Where twice a month I give welcome to Mahjong classes. So if you are anywhere in a town that has any kind of a game store, drop by and see what they recommend.
Excellent. Love those local game stores. They can be so fun. So with that, I just want to say thank you to the panelists. And we have many questions that the audience has asked. But in terms of what I see, someone has asked, Christina Jordan is curious on how do each of you see the future of Mahjong? Who will be the new demographics that will play? And are there going to be, what about new art or styles on the tiles? So the future of Mahjong.
Well, I'll just start. I think the reason that Mahjong is the most popular pastime in the world, and it is because it's been evolving and different cultures have made it their own. So I think it's really going to continue to evolve. I think that, you know, the tiles may evolve, the rules may evolve, things are going to change, but that's why Mahjong is so popular, because it does allow itself to change. It's not like a board game that is stagnant. The Mahjong can change, the hands can change. So that's what I think the future is. I think it's going to attract, I think it should be attracting everybody. That's, you know, no big plans, just everybody.
More people playing Mahjong.
I will add to that it's one of the few games that you can jump in at any level. 4 people sitting around a table. If one has been playing for 10 years and she's introducing her friend that day, they'll both have a wonderful time. Ask me about tennis. No, you got to have a level of expertise with tennis. And no, Mahjong, everybody at the table is going to have a great game.
I think, you know, we are living in a Mahjong resurgence there in a lot of different ways. And as I mentioned before, it is continuing to diversify. I think as things continue to evolve and change, I think it remains an open question over what are certain forms of Mahjong going to evolve into an entirely different game altogether. I think one open question is if we start to have more sets where we can't recognize the same basic patterns of, oh yeah, I get that that's a BAM in American Mahjong parlance, BAM or bamboo tile. I get that that's a dot or a circle tile, right? Because it shares some basic patterns, even if the specific images are different. and the rules are different, right? You can't just sit down and play the same game. I think if you take away all of the elements that make something recognizable across difference, then I think you have to ask, at what point is this actually a new game? Is it actually a fundamentally different game? And so that is something that I'm starting to see that possibility kind of emerge in the long history of the game. Games do evolve. And I think one question is, what keeps a game coherent or recognizable across difference? And what do we have when those things go away? So we will see.
Some big questions to ask in the evolution of the game. I have one last question, and for everyone else who has asked the question in the Q&A, we won't be able to get to everyone, unfortunately, but we can save these questions, and I will make sure to get them to the panelists, and if to possibly email you back or to continue kind of follow up on that. But someone asked, how many Mahjong players do you estimate are in the US, and how much has it grown? So whoever can give a rough estimate of that, it's probably a very difficult answer to address.
There are millions of players in the United States playing many different versions of the game. The National Mahjong League, I think, claims 350,000 members, but many more than that are playing the National Mahjong version of the game. And then there are just so many. I mean, that was their last tally, but then there are just so many different ways to play out there, because then there's Wright Patterson, and there are different Chinese versions, and some people have gone back to the Babcock version. So I would say, there could even be 10 million people playing the game right now. I mean, minimum. And really growing exponentially, as we've been discussing.
Lots of people. Wonderful. So it is approached 7. So unfortunately we have to wrap it up, but thank you so much, panelists, for this very interesting, rich discussion. I'm excited to continue to learn more about Mahjong, and I feel like this has kind of been a taste and a stepping stone to how to engage such a complex game. So I will give the chance for Gao Qing, our executive director, to say a quick thank you and farewell to all of the panelists. And for everyone who has participated, thank you very much. Oh, it looks like he actually had an internet connection issue and he's not on. So I will give a farewell. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees, for engaging this conversation. We will save the questions and answers, and we'll see in how to address those and to share email resources. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.
You too.